Hi, good afternoon, good evening for those of you who are here. We're going to wait for maybe another 3 to 4 minutes before we begin, so please be patient. We're all here, but we'll start very soon. Again, welcome everyone who's joining us. We'll start in just a couple of minutes. Okay, I think we're going to begin. I think we're ready to do so. So I'd like to begin by welcoming all of you to our fourth event in the series Understanding Systemic Racism. I'm Anupama Rao, the Associate Director of ICLS and organizer of the Ambedkar Initiative, which links the anti-caste legacy of Columbia alum, political theorist, and constitutional thinker B.R. Ambedkar with broad, enduring questions about historical difference and ongoing redress. I'd like to start by thanking our co-sponsors who've made this series possible. The Office of the EVP of Arts and Sciences, the Barnard Provost's Office, the Office of the Deans of Humanities and Social Sciences, and a series of departments and institutes that I'll merely call out by acronym: EROS, AAADS, IRCPL, MISAS, Caesar, and then the Columbia Libraries and Columbia University Press. This year-long series is a response to our current conjuncture, starting with the extraordinary mobilization against historic discrimination, inequality, and the assault on life and human flourishing that we witnessed this summer. We seem poised for a political change, one that cannot come soon enough for most of us in these disunited states. But this moment has also, of course, made racial and political agonism visible as something that's both enduring and ongoing, structured and structuring, located at the very heart of the nation's founding. Where we will go or cannot go has everything to do with our confrontation with this past and its sadly predictable recurrence and repetition. The 44th, I can't even say that name, is merely the manifestation of something far deeper and more dangerous, more intimate that haunts the Republic. So how better to deal with this nail-biting anxiety than to have a chance to speak with our wonderful guests this morning. Nico Slate is professor of history at Carnegie Mellon University and author of numerous works, including the recently published Lord Cornwallis is Dead, The Struggle for Democracy in the United States and India, as well as the classic Colored Cosmopolitanism, The Shared Struggle for Freedom in the United States and India, in addition to numerous other books, including on Gandhi, Cedric Dover, and so on. Sonali Perera is professor of English and comparative literature at Hunter College and at the Graduate Center at CUNY. She is the author of No Country, Working Class Writing in the Age of Globalization, and she's currently at work on a monograph entitled Imperialism, Between Imperialism and Internationalism, World Literature and Human Rights. This afternoon, Nico will speak for about 35 to 40 minutes. Sonali will offer some thoughts and responses for about 10 minutes. And we will have about 20 minutes together for Q&A. I'll try to gather 3 questions or so at a time so that we can keep as many voices in the mix as possible. So please keep your questions focused and brief. And I'd like to yet again extend a very warm welcome to Nico and Sonali this Friday afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anupama, and thank you, Sonali, in advance for sharing your thoughts and questions. I'd also like to thank all of you who are listening in. Speaking via Zoom is, as I expect many of you know, a very strange and mysterious experience. There are many parts of it I don't like. I in many ways prefer to see the people who I'm speaking with and to be able to hear from them directly. But there is one thing I like about it, which is that I know many of you are in different parts of the world, and there is something magical about being able to all be brought together in this way. So I'd like to again thank you, Anu, very much for this invitation, and it's a real honor and pleasure to be speaking in this capacity. And Sonali, thank you as well in advance for your comments. I'm going to begin with a story that is central to my first work, Colored Cosmopolitanism. It's a story that involves this woman, Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya, who I expect at least a goodly number of the folks on this particular call know. My students almost never know of, which I find a real tragedy. It's a story that takes place in the spring of 1941, when Kamaladevi was around the middle point of her trip across the United States. She was traveling by train across the American South, and the train had just crossed the border of Louisiana when the conductor came up to her and ordered her to move. She was sitting in what was then called a whites-only car. She looked at the conductor and she said, "Why?" And he replied, "That is the rule, and you better obey it or you will regret it." She did not move. He goes away, studies her. After a while, he comes back and he says, "Where are you from?" She replies evasively. She says, "I'm coming from New York." And he says, No, which land are you from?" Making clear that he's figured out she's not, in fact, African American. She's from some other part of the world. And as many of you know, in the strange world of the Jim Crow South, being from another part of the world, even being from Africa, it sometimes, in some cases, exempt one from the strange racial borders of that system. But Kamaladevi refused to play along. Rather than saying that she was a famous Indian freedom fighter, friends with Mahatma Gandhi, that she had actually just spoken to the United States Congress, to the United States Supreme Court, and had tea with the President Franklin Roosevelt and his wife Eleanor Roosevelt, instead of saying any of that, she said, "I am a colored woman, obviously, and I refuse to leave my seat." Well, the conductor muttered, "You are an Asian," but he didn't bother her again. Now, that phrase, "I am a colored woman," was for Kamaladevi a deliberate act to link her identity as someone from India to the struggles of African Americans who were at that moment in time called colored, or at least in many instances, that was the term that was used to describe African Americans. And Kamaladevi was not alone in using the idea of color to link the people of South Asia to African Americans, and in fact to other people of color throughout the world. She was drawing on a long legacy of what I call colored cosmopolitanism, a legacy that had been pioneered by this man, W.E.B. Du Bois, who again I expect does not need an introduction in this group. Du Bois.
Nico, I'm so sorry to interrupt you.
Yes.
If you are meaning to share your screen, we can't see it.
Oh no! All right, let me try it again.
Sorry to
that's a trouble. All right, we thought we were sharing screens here. Let me do it again. All right, here we go. No problem. I'm glad you interrupted me. Let's try this again, and please do tell me if it's successful this time.
Yes, this is good.
All right, excellent. Okay, well, you heard the stories already, so I'll just show you the images, but thank you for interrupting me. So yes, indeed, I started with Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya. I transitioned to Du Bois, and that's the only images I've shared so far, so you haven't missed too much, friends. Okay, I was talking about how Du Bois is very well known for the famous statement that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. He said that in a speech and then published it in one of his most famous texts. But what's often forgotten is that he globalized the color line. He did not see it solely in terms of the division between white and black within the territorial bounds of the United States. For Du Bois, the color line was a global structure that involved not just Jim Crow, not just American racism beyond Jim Crow, the North and the West, for example, but also white supremacy and imperialism in Asia, Africa, Latin America, and elsewhere. And he was quite explicit about that. And from the late 19th century throughout the rest of his life, he conceived of his political project in part as forging solidarities within what he often called the dark or colored world. So when Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya says, "I am a colored woman" on that train, she is engaging in that process of solidarity building. And she did that repeatedly and in a variety of ways, in writings, in interviews with African-American reporters, in connections with African-American activists at that time. She repeatedly uses this idea of colored solidarity and dark solidarity, building on the foundation that Du Bois had laid in order to form a really quite rich and expansive conception of colored solidarity. There were several other people involved in this project. One that I ended up being moved to write a short biography on is a fascinating figure named Cedric Dover. Again, I expect some of you are familiar with Dover. Those who aren't, I encourage you to learn more. He's a very rich and complicated person who was born in Kolkata, then Calcutta, just after the turn of the century, and was born into what is sometimes known as the Anglo-Indian community. Dover himself preferred to identify as Eurasian. This is a community that is explicitly defined as mixed in origin, and that was very important for Dover. He ends up becoming one of the world's experts on so-called mixed race people. But interestingly, and this is an important point I'm going to build on, is that he often used the term half caste rather than mixed race. Even though he was aware that what he was talking about within the context of colonial India would not have been seen so much as a form of caste, he chose that term, half caste, for his most famous book, and often used ideas of caste to explain his vision of racial mixture and of the solidarities that existed between different peoples who descended of racial mixture. So whereas Du Bois is pioneering a conception of solidarity based on color, Dover buys into that very strongly, but also sees potential solidarities between different communities of mixed descent in different parts of the world, and sees African Americans as one of those communities. All right, so we have what I'm doing, friends, so far, just to provide a little bit of bird's eye view here is I'm tracing the intellectual origins of the conception of colored cosmopolitanism through a few of the key figures that played a part in this. There were many others, and I'll share at least a few others as we progress. But I'm also trying to indicate that one of the things I've always found so interesting about colored cosmopolitanism as a social, political, and intellectual project is that it wasn't solely focused on conceptions of race. There were other key forms of identity that were at play. Kamaladevi says, I am a colored woman, and her identity as a woman is extraordinarily important to her. We can talk more about that. For Dover, there's at least some conception that caste is also a key form of identity. And there are others that think even more about those different forms of analogy. Here's the quote from Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya's text, America, Land of Superlatives. This is, and I'll just read it along with you. Soon Africa too will come back. Oh, hold on. Let's see if I can see it here. I've got you all. There we go. Soon Africa too will come back and come into her own, and the dark ones will cease to be the untouchables of the world. The international color line has been challenged and stormed by Asia. No more the colonials will allow themselves to be Jim Crowed the world over and their country looted under pseudo slogans. The Negro problem will only cease when the color line of imperialism vanishes, when science becomes the benefactor of man and knowledge his friend, and human respect for each other and for the sanctity of life are observed as the codes of our daily life. I find this quite remarkable in a variety of ways. One of the key things I want to pull out is just the fact that Kamaladevi here is overlapping multiple forms of analogy and multiple kinds of solidarity, packing them together, overlaying them, and creating what I see as quite a robust and multifaceted conception of the struggle that she sees herself fighting. Let me just point out here. So we have the color line of imperialism. Of course, imperialism was in part a racialized project. Of course, it was bound up with white supremacy. But what we're seeing here from Du Bois through Dover and Kamaladevi is a response to that racial colonial project that was actively forging solidarities across the borders of both race and nation. And it goes beyond that. So she uses Jim Crow as a global conception, right? Colonials have been Jim Crowed the world over, but she also references the untouchables of the world. And I think that's deliberate. She puts it in quotes. It's clear she's not explicitly referencing caste at this moment, but I think she is including caste as it was practiced in India within this larger universe of hierarchies and forms of oppression that one must fight against. All right. One more person. This won't be entirely biographical. I do like to think with people, but I have one more figure for you, and then we're gonna, I believe, broaden out a bit. So let me give you one more example of this kind of analogizing at play. This is one of my favorite historical examples. Pauli Murray, again, I expect some of you are familiar with, renowned civil rights activist, feminist, just a dynamic and remarkable human being in a variety of ways. Also has her own experience of facing discrimination on Jim Crow transportation, almost at the same time, actually, as Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya. Pauli Murray is arrested on a bus traveling through the state of Virginia. She didn't actually plan to be arrested. She was sitting at the very back of the bus with a young African-American woman. They were traveling home for the holidays, and the problem was that the back seat of the bus became unhinged and was not comfortable to sit in. They tried to move to the middle of the bus. The driver demanded they move back. At this point, Pauli Murray stands up and gives a speech about democracy, in the words of one observer, and the driver has both Murray and her traveling companion arrested. There are layers and layers and layers of this particular story. I'm just going to share two with you briefly. I'm conscious of time here. One is that Murray was at that moment dressed in clothes associated with men and was, I think one could say, passing as a man, if you want to put it that way. Murray's gender and sexual identity were much more fluid than was conceived as the norm in those days, or sadly even in our world today, she struggled actually for a long period of time to try to make sense of her gender identity, of her sexual identity. That was a long process. Again, if we had more time, it's a really rich subject to talk about. At the moment of that arrest, it was a tremendous problem for her, because she's at the moment of arrest, the police think they're arresting a young African-American man and a young African-American woman, and Murray could have ended up in a male prison, but instead manages with her friends' help to create a diversion and basically transition, if you will, back into being presented as a woman, in a way that she ends up, both her and her friend both end up going to a female prison. That, again, it's a very rich part of the story, and I'd be delighted to talk more about it. The part I want to focus on is actually how Murray responds to this arrest by turning to the Gandhian civil disobedience that she has studied in India, and trying to launch what she calls her own satyagraha. She uses that word, a word I expect many of you are already familiar with, the term of choice for Gandhi and many others for nonviolent civil disobedience. And she draws up a remarkable document. This is in the Pauli Murray papers at the Schlesinger Library in Cambridge. She creates this remarkable series of comparisons, analogies, if you will, between the struggles of the people of India and of African Americans. We could go through this at length if we have time, but the key thing I want to point out is that many of her comparisons suggested that the use of nonviolent civil disobedience would work better for the people of India, for example, whereas African Americans are the minority. Within India, you have a well-disciplined movement, whereas African Americans had a lack of discipline, again, according to Murray. So she has this long chart of comparisons, and yet, despite the fact that she concludes that the Indian struggle has many advantages, she still sets out to launch her own satyagraha, and plays a very important role, actually, in advancing nonviolent methods in the struggle against American racism. I'm bringing Murray into the mix here because nonviolence plays a key role in the long story of linkages between African American and South Asian freedom struggles. In fact, it's usually the dominant note in the story, but there are many other key analogies at play here. And today, what I want to do is to look at the way in which analogies between race and caste often were they passed in and out of being at the center of these linkages. Sometimes nonviolence becomes the key form of connection. Sometimes it's colored solidarity, but often always at play, and to one degree or another highlighted, were analogies between race and caste. And those analogies could be used in a variety of different ways. So let me give you, I think, a really rich example of how two historical figures could use analogies between race and caste in ways that were, on the one hand, in some ways opposite, and yet, on the other hand, in some ways, both aiming towards what I would see as the progress towards a more egalitarian and open society. So I'll start with Lala Lajpat Rai. Again, I expect I don't have to say too much about Lajpat Rai, anti-colonial figure from the Punjab, who spends long periods of time outside of India, including in the United States. And during his first sojourn in the United States, Lajpat Rai writes that the condition of those who we would today call Dalits in India, those who were at one time called untouchables, and Lajpat Rai actually uses the word pariah, which is, of course, is a word of Indian origin that then gets generalized and used in other contexts. It says the pariahs of India are equivalent to African Americans within the United States. That's those are not exactly his words. He used the word pariah, but that's he equates these two communities and suggests that they're both struggling for freedom. Lajpat Rai was, I would suggest, or I would argue, very committed to ending the practice of untouchability, and actually ending caste inequality more generally. He was also very firmly committed to ending racism and formed very strong ties with African Americans, including with W.E.B. Du Bois. So Lajpat Rai creates this equality. That's early in his time in the United States. But then later in the late 1920s, there is an infamous text published by an American, Catherine Mayo. Some of you will know the rich history involved here, the text Mother India, which is really an attack on Indian society and civilization. It's a pro-imperial tract that argues that ultimately Indian peoples need to be controlled by a more benevolent white imperialist system. And many different Indian figures respond in press and in otherwise. Lajpat Rai is one of them. He writes a book in response that attacks Mayo. And Lajpat Rai decides to again employ the race caste analogy. In this case, he actually uses a different one. So rather than equating African Americans and pariahs, again, his term, in India, he says that that African Americans were decidedly worse than pariahs, that in fact racism in the United States was worse than caste in India. Now, that kind of analogy, it's one that says one thing is worse than the other, can often be used to shield a particular society or country from criticisms from outside. And in some ways, that's precisely what Lajpat Rai is doing, is he's defending India against the criticism of Catherine Mayo and those that would support her. But I think that it's actually very important to recognize that the text he's writing is aimed primarily at an American audience. And his goal is to convince Americans that they should clean up their own messes before they try to go off and support British imperialism in South Asia. Now, contrast that with Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. I know for sure that I don't need to introduce him in this particular talk or venue. Ambedkar was also extraordinarily familiar with the United States, as I expect many of you know, perhaps all of you know. He came to study at Columbia and spent considerable extensively at American Society, and was also very opposed to American racism. Ambedkar, like Lajpat Rai, employs the race caste analogy, but in the exact opposite hierarchy. So instead of suggesting that racism in the United States was worse than caste oppression in India, Ambedkar says that caste is worse than racism. In fact, in a couple instances, he says that in fact caste in India is even worse than chattel slavery was in the United States. Now, why would Ambedkar do that? It again could be seen as diminishing, in this case, diminishing the struggle of African Americans, diminishing the wrong of slavery. But in this case, Ambedkar is writing primarily to an audience within India, and he's urging other Indians to confront the severity of caste and caste oppression and to end it. And so even though Lajpat Rai and Ambedkar are taking, in many ways, opposite stances here, and Ambedkar actually directly refutes Lajpat Rai, calls him out on this point. The way I look at it is that it's a very good demonstration that when we are to assess an analogy, any kind of historical analogy, in this case, the analogy between race and caste, we have to pay attention to the motivation. We have to pay attention to the audience. So in this case, Lajpat Rai is moved by an effort to defend India against a specious colonial, neo-colonial assault. And he's addressing Americans. Ambedkar is moved by the desire to attack caste in India, and he's attacking Indians. So even though they have exactly the opposite hierarchies, to my view, they're both advancing the egalitarian cause. I should note, just in passing, that Ambedkar, I expect many of you know this already, Ambedkar writes directly to Du Bois in an effort to try to forge stronger ties between the struggle against caste in India and the African-American struggle against racism. But that linkage it has been largely occluded, at least in the United States, and I would argue in many other places as well, by the more famous relationship between Martin Luther King and Gandhi. I have a lot I could say about that tie. I'm going to try to be brief here because I want to make sure we have time for Sonali's comments and questions and for all of you to factor in as well. I will say that if you look at King's long engagement with Gandhi, Gandhian nonviolence, and India more generally, you see that there is it wasn't just about nonviolence. That's something I've argued at length. King was very interested in ideas of colored solidarity, of the dark world. He writes repeatedly about the way in which the African-American struggle is part of a larger anti-colonial struggle, the rising up of Asia and Africa against white imperialism. And when he goes to India, this is King and Coretta Scott King being greeted at the airport. He is not just interested in paying homage to Gandhi, although of course he does that. He's also interested as he traverses India. This is just a map of his travels. He goes all over the place. He's also interested at learning from the way in which independent India is confronting its own legacies of discrimination, caste in particular. So when he meets with, this is him paying homage to Gandhi. When he meets with Nehru, a lot of their conversation is actually focused not on the Indian struggle for independence, but on rather the ways in which the Nehru government was or was not addressing caste inequality in contemporary India. King leaves quite impressed by Nehru and his government's approaches. We could talk about whether he should be impressed, but he was quite impressed. And he comes back to the US eager to share what he's learned. He gives some really remarkable speeches, in one of which he tells this story about giving a talk to a school of Dalits in Kerala, is what King says, in which he is introduced as an untouchable from the United States. And King says that at first he's really thrown by this. He doesn't see himself as untouchable, but as he thinks about all of the conditions in which his people have suffered, he realizes that, in fact, yes, that does apply to him. Now, I should note that that story is one that King lifts and adapts from a mentor of his, Benjamin Mays, African-American theologian who traveled in India many years earlier and, in fact, had that experience of being introduced as a former untouchable. King draws on that story, makes it his own in a way that he often does in his speeches. But I find it still quite remarkable because King chose to do that. And when he takes Mays's version, he adapts it and makes it his own and shows the degree to which King was grappling with what African Americans could learn from the struggle against caste, not just the struggle against British imperialism. I'm cognizant of time here, friends. I don't want to take too much more time, but I'll try to speed up a little bit. I wanted to talk a little bit about the range of folks from India who aim to bring these sorts of analogies into the African-American freedom struggle. It's not just Gandhi that African-Americans learn from. There are many other Indian figures. This is one of my favorite photos. It's, again, Martin Luther King, Coretta Scott King with, oh goodness, can't see my notes. I'm trying to remember there. So Ahmed Mir and Jaswant Krishnaiah on the two corners are two Indian students at MIT who just happened to read about the American Civil Rights Movement and decide to head south to see how they could get involved. It's really quite a remarkable story. Both of whom I interviewed for my first book. Ahmed Mir shared this image with me and a few other images. One I think I'll show you. This is them meeting at Morehouse College with J.B. Kripalani and Suchetana Kripalani, both renowned Indian freedom fighters, remarkable figures both in their own ways. They all participated in an astonishing gathering with young African-American SNCC activists, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee activists, talking about what could be learned from the struggle in India. A lot of the conversation is focused on nonviolence, not surprisingly, but caste is also another key thing that is discussed and engaged. And there's a strong interest in learning not just from how Indians overcame colonialism, but how they were struggling against caste in contemporary India. These linkages move forward in time. This is a subject we could have a whole conversation about, the Dalit Panthers. I expect many of you are already familiar, but it's another example of race caste analogies being used in remarkably creative ways. In this case, an organization of Dalits a lot of the initial group here is full of poets and artists and intellectuals. It eventually diversifies, it has this more of a political, becomes a political party. I can talk more about that if we have the opportunity. But they're drawing, of course, on the Black Panthers, one of multiple groups that do so. I helped edit a volume called Black Power Beyond Borders, in which we have different chapters on different groups, communities in different parts of the world that draw on the Black Panthers. There's a Polynesian Panthers in New Zealand, Israeli Panthers, and I wrote the chapter there in that particular book on the Dalit Panthers. It's a rich and remarkable history, again, in which the race caste analogy is being used, in this case, to bring lessons from the African-American struggle into India rather than vice versa. All right, friends, I'm going to try to wrap up here because I'm very excited to hear Sonali, her comments, questions, ideas, and I would like to hear from you all. I want to try to take a step back for a minute and think about what we can draw from this rich history. I find many of these figures profoundly personally inspiring, and they're people that I try to learn from in my own life, my own humble forms of activism and engagement with my students. And two of the figures I keep coming back to are Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya and Pauli Murray. I told you some of their stories earlier. Their stories are much richer than I could fit into this particular talk. But there's a couple key things I would say about these figures that I hold on to. One is the key thing I've talked about today, which is the power of the analogy as a form of solidarity building, particularly when those analogies are used to bring people together in ways that don't box them into only one identity. So when Kamaladevi's on that train and says, I'm a colored woman, she's not saying that my identity as a colored person trumps all other forms of my identity. No, she's saying, I'm going to fight against racism. I'm going to fight against sexism. I'm going to fight against casteism, classism, all at the same time, right? There's an intersectional dynamism to her approach to these issues. And Pauli Murray has exactly the same way of thinking about her struggle. And so that's one key point. The other key point I would suggest we say that, and I haven't really emphasized this, but maybe it'll come out more in the questions and comments, is that there's a profound amount of misconception, misunderstanding, missed opportunities in this history. It's a history that's easy to romanticize, but in my own work, one thing I try to do consistently is to push back against that romantic urge when thinking about the transnational in particular, and to pay attention to what is obscured, what is elided, what is forgotten, what is misunderstood in that process. And the story of Kamaladevi and Pauli Murray, for example, often gets pushed to the side when we think about the sort of triumph of nonviolent civil disobedience as the key narrative linking India and the US. And we end up with this sort of great man story of Martin Luther King learning single-handedly from Gandhi. There were many, many more people involved in these transnational, transracial solidarities. And those solidarities were not just about nonviolence. They were about race, they were about anti-colonialism, they were about gender and sexuality, and they were very much also about caste. Last but not least, I put democracy in the title of this talk on purpose because we were so close to the election. That's a whole other thing we could talk about where we stand right now with the election. I'd be delighted to talk about it. I'm sitting here in Pennsylvania. It's obviously very much on my mind, as I expect it is on many of yours as well. I just wanted to point out something that's a rich historical connection I'm very interested in, and I would welcome any thoughts any of you might have. We have here Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya and Kamaladevi Harris. Kamala Harris's middle name, Devi, is one that she often signs with. And I think there is at least some reason to believe that, in fact, Kamala Harris was named after Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya. I can't prove this historically. I've had some conversations with folks that have pushed back on this with me. I haven't found any clear evidence, but I will say that Kamaladevi Harris's grandfather was very connected to the freedom struggle, would certainly have known of Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya, if not known her directly. And Kamala Harris's mother studied at a college that was partially founded by Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya. So I think there's some decent evidence here that there might have been some direct linkages in terms of the naming. In any case, what's more interesting for me is the question of to what degree in our historical world right now, the legacy of these solidarities is still at play with us. And I will say in the United States, and I'd like to talk about India as well if we have the opportunity, but I will say, given the election, I'll focus here on the United States. I see a tremendous importance to the ongoing legacy of colored solidarity and other forms of alliance between different communities fighting against oppression and fighting for freedom. And I personally believe that Kamala Harris is one of the leaders we have in this country who embodies that kind of solidarity, not just because of her parental lineage, not just because she is, again, to use Cedric Dover's way of thinking about this, of mixed racial origin, but more so because of the way she conceives of the world, the way she conceives of the issues that are most pressing for us, the ways in which she is trying to bring people together across different boundaries and borders to fight for a better democracy here in this country and more freedom throughout the world. All right, friends, I am going to end there and sharing my screen if I can. Forgive me, I hope I didn't take too long there, but this is a real opportunity and a pleasure for me to talk with you all. I'm delighted to hear from Sonali now, and I look forward to hearing all of your questions as well. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. And thanks, Sonali.
Thank you. First, let me add my thanks also to Anu and to Sarah for organizing, and thanks to Columbia's Institute for Comparative Literature and Society for having these series of conversations in connection with such an important topic, understanding systemic racism. And thank you, Nico, for your wonderful, rich, detailed talk and your book. And perhaps mostly for giving us this occasion to gather, to discuss something meaningful and good during this interregnum period week where, you know, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear for all of us, where the outcome of so much hangs in the balance as we, wait for every vote to be counted. I will very briefly say this. I worry that I'm not the ideal or proper respondent for this talk. I say this with all humility. I'm not a scholar of caste or cosmopolitanism. Rather, the object of my studies has been the dialectic between race and class, which of course is not unconnected from thinking about race and caste. And I've taken my bearings, though, from South Asian writers and thinkers, some tracking back to the early moment of 1930s anti-colonial labor struggles, who've envisioned the possibilities, but also reckoned with the pitfalls of and impasses to something like working class solidarities or labor internationalism. That language of internationalism, I'm curious to hear if that language also emerges in different ways in some of the historical figures that you brought forward for us to think about, Nico. That said, I couldn't possibly turn down this wonderful opportunity to be in some way even angularly connected to the work undertaken by the Ambedkar Initiative, and having begun to really read and think with your book, Colored Cosmopolitanism, Nico, which I'm grateful that I at least have started to engage with, because in this pandemic mode, it's harder for me to synthesize things. And you gave us so much wonderful, such historical breadth, but also such important ideas to think with, that I'm glad that I have some kind of narrative arc to also situate the comments that you made here today in terms of a broader span. One of the things that I want to sort of foreground, I find I share and I really want to honor, is to our collective desire to critically recover and give meaning to these moments lost to charting genealogies of anti-racist solidarity, to these moments that allow us to connect struggles across national borders, right? Thinking about the moment that you began your talk to us with, but also the moment that is a key frame of reference for your book, Kamaladevi's solidarity statement made in 1941 while she's traveling in that segregated train in the American South, is definitely one frame of reference for colored cosmopolitanism. But listening to your talk, sort of really also getting a sense of the ways in which you expand and elaborate and complicate that frame, thinking of questions of audience, thinking about the uses and abuses of analogy, the power of analogy. I want to just quote also to underscore the point that you made, to sort of turn a little bit. I find it very instructive, the nuanced and complicated set of questions that you pose about our collective desire, this collective desire of ours, the academic historian, cultural critic, to come to terms with this desire for connecting the struggles. And this is from your introduction, Nico. You ask, what does it mean to say that social movements on opposite ends of the world were connected, ranging from statements of sympathy to coordinated acts of solidarity? The connections analyzed in the following pages often involved selective appropriation and at times outright misunderstanding. Many historical actors oversimplified or entirely overlooked the many differences between the social, political, and economic challenges facing African Americans and South Asians. Words like freedom or colored contain not only distinct histories and competing dreams, but also the ability to hide these differences. It's not enough, however, to note that freedom meant different things to different people at different times. Rather, the challenge is to understand how historical agents employed such keywords to bridge differences and to achieve transnational solidarities. Then again, this caveat that you bring up a bit later on, you ask us to note that by forging solidarity across racial and national borders, African Americans and South Asians sometimes challenged and sometimes reinforced prevailing conceptions of race and nation, as well as class, caste, and gender. I bring this up also because the broader frame, the work that you bring forward also gives us this task of really engaging with, and this I find a really useful and helpful word to think with, interactional histories, right? I find it really productive to think with and find it powerful because it seems to signal for me that marking these pitfalls and these sort of really vigilant uses, non-romanticizing uses of the power of analogy. It seems to signal that the work that you call us to do must be attentive also to the counter-signature, not just from Du Bois, maybe, but perhaps even from lesser known organic intellectuals. And also this interactional history signals for me that it's an ongoing task for us. And here I'm thinking about a moment that you didn't bring up in the talk, but in really thinking about the kinds of comments that someone that was very instructive to me to learn about, someone I know, the historical figure I know about, Swami Vivekananda, and the kinds of comments that he makes about race and racial difference, sometimes cringe-worthy, you know, situating it within context. And I wondered where the, how and where those comments would be read and received and responded to in ways. And thinking about beginnings and emblematic frames of references. I think reading and thinking with your work in this particular moment and really thinking within that temporality of interactional histories and unfinished tasks to be undertaken, I'm reminded that beginnings are always provisional. So in that sense, I understand sort of beginning with Kamaladevi's impulse there on the train. And I'm not very familiar with the broad span of Kamaladevi's, impact, but thinking about how she's taken up in histories of diplomacy and the UN as well. I'm here put in mind of a kind of a new book that my colleague Manu Bhagavan, who has sort of taken up the history of Vijayalakshmi Pandit, Nehru's sister, in the context of a history of human rights. So sort of thinking about this figure. And you I think also raised the question of how sort of retroactively thinking about even in our terms, our lexicon of the moment, Kamaladevi comes across as connecting the struggles as an intersectional sort of prototypical feminist figure. And I think I've seen some new scholarship that is actively trying to engage that kind of idea. Right. So beginnings are always provisional, and thinking about sort of other kinds of work that to me seem to be in conversation with the work that you're doing. I'm reminded of, I don't know if this resonates, but I'm reminded of W.E.B's work on Bengali Harlem. And he begins with Ibrahim Chowdhury's speeches and letters to the United States, committees on immigration as an index or departure point. I mean, the sort of devil's advocate provocation that I want to throw up is, sort of thinking about where, sort of actively thinking about where we begin, and really maybe wondering about what it would mean. I learned so much and was really taken by thinking about Pauli Murray as a figure, not the least also because when I hear colored cosmopolitanism, I also think of South Africa and the way in which colored resonates completely differently. And if sort of Gandhi is a kind of leitmotif or repressed kind of motif in this text, there's all kinds of things to be said in that register, I think. But also, just in sort of wrapping up these kinds of comments and scattered speculations, as I was preparing for the comments and thinking with your work, I was reminded of Angela Davis's recent solidarity statement. In terms of thinking about the genre of the solidarity statement, there has been this horrible, brutal rape and murder of a Dalit woman in Uttar Pradesh, right? And Angela Davis has been working a lot in terms of Angela Davis's solidarity statement that she recorded sort of put forth this explicit articulation of the struggles between Dalit struggles and Black Lives Matter. And so I was thinking about the power, and now again, in terms of sort of really thinking about the limits and openings of this kind of analogizing. I was really struck by that statement that was put out and the ways in which it would register and resonate also for feminist and for global feminist struggles and Dalit struggles in this way. And I suppose, again, and thinking about it critically also, this is this is Angela Davis. And so it's not as if it is a statement coming from a rank and file protester of the Black Lives Matter movement, but that one has to sort of think about that power and see it as something that moves us forward in this way. And I think I'm curious to see the sort of narrative arc of your talk and where it ends with Kamala Harris. I'm going to provisionally at least end with Angela Davis. All right.
That's great. Thank you. Nico, do you want to take a moment to respond to any comments and questions, and then we can take up questions from the floor?
Absolutely. Thank you. The challenge will be just taking a moment, because Sonali, that was such a gift. Thank you very much. You left me with a lot that I want to think about more, and I'm really honored to have received those comments and questions. I took notes as you spoke. I came up with three things I'll just touch on very briefly. One is you referenced early on this idea of internationalism, and then another point you mentioned Manu Bhagavan's work, the idea of the UN, and I think one of the ways to think about the long trajectory of colored cosmopolitanism is to think about what happens after India gains its independence, and what happens after the victories of the American Civil Rights Movement, which of course are not complete in any way, but there were some significant victories in the mid-1960s. What happens to these conceptions of colored solidarity, of the dark world, in the era of the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and then up into the present? And of course, there emerges a narrative of the third world, right? Conceptions of the third world, of third world solidarity that become very important in many different parts of the world. And yet the idea of color or colored solidarity drops out of that. And India's role in the sort of third world narrative is, on the one hand, very important because of the non-aligned movement and non-aligned status, but it's also extremely different from the way in which colored solidarity was conceived in the anti-colonial movement. And there is, I think, to some degree, a declension narrative here. I don't like to frame it purely that way, but I do think that there is something lost when there's a transition from the transnational, or you put it interestingly, interactional, to the international. And the key difference as I see it there is that that you shift from activists forging solidarities to resist state power, to diplomats representing states and trying to forge connections between states. And of course, those sorts of connections and solidarities could lead to positive outcomes, but they were often so high up in the stratosphere in terms of privilege and power and affluence that they could be quite removed from the struggles that were percolating up below. And so I do think that there's a real loss there when the conception of colored solidarity that gets forged, by people like Du Bois, shifts over time and ends up becoming something more focused on international solidarity. You mentioned Vivek Bald and his work, Bengali Harlem. That's a wonderful book for anyone listening who hasn't read it. It's an amazing book. And one of the things that Bald has looked at, and several other historians as well, that I look at in part, is the way that conceptions of color and colored solidarity play out, particularly within the South Asian American community and that narrative. The presentation I gave today really focused at connections between African Americans and people in India or people coming from India and then going back, like Kamaladevi or Lala Lajpat Rai. But of course, there's another story here about folks coming from India and staying in the US and putting down roots and having children. Story, at least in part. And there, the story gets even more complicated, as I'm sure, Sonali, I know you know already. Others maybe are not as familiar, but the long history of South Asian Americans trying to claim the privileges of whiteness, from Bhagat Singh Thind, and earlier. There's a tension there, right? If you enter a racialized hierarchical system, Isabel Wilkerson, I know you're all hearing from, we'll call a caste system. Where you enter that system, you're torn between trying to fight against it, as many did, or trying to rise up in the ranks within it. And so there was a pressure for many South Asian Americans to try to claim whiteness. And as I've written about before, and others have written too, there's a very interesting caste dimension to this, because the argument that Bhagat Singh Thind and many others make is not that everyone from India deserves to be white, but rather that northern-born high caste Indians deserve to be seen as white, right? So it's a very rich and interesting intersection between race and caste. The last thing I'll say just very briefly is I really appreciated how you use that phrase, the genre of the solidarity statement, and your discussion of Angela Davis's words is incredibly rich. And I think there's a lot to be done there with looking at what those statements mean and how they can mean more in our current moment. I'll pause there. I could go on even more. That was a very rich comment, Sonali. I'm very grateful for it, but I do want to save time to bring in other questions as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you both very, very much. We'll just take a moment because, and you'll see my eyes wandering up and down the Q&A. We've got a couple of questions, and we have actually 3. And maybe I'll go from the end up towards the top of my screen with the questions. And there are 3 in particular that I will throw at you both, and please feel free, each of you, to take them on or to respond. So I'll start with one from Suraj. My question, he says, how do we confront or come to terms with the celebration of dominant caste painting of the oppressed solidarity? Is there a way to revisit this intellectual project than celebrating Brahmins or dominant caste defense, that is Lala Lajpat Rai? Even today, Brahmins, dominant caste white scholars occupy that historical position of interlocutors between Black and Dalit, a la caste and race position. If history is to be constructed anew, maybe establishing a new contemporary project would do, right? So can we recover someone like Cedric Dover? He asks to advance a race caste analogy, solidarity, in a kind of anthropological mode. And I think this is very important. I think it touches directly on the question of solidarity and the genre of the solidarity statement, but also questions of allyship, questions of expropriation, questions of representation, indeed of perhaps a kind of necessary silence from so-called allies in order to allow other solidarities to blossom, and so forth. So I think this is important. Let me throw at you the other 2 questions we've got on the table. They're each different, forgive me. The other is a really lovely one I think both of you will like. I was wondering if perhaps you could elaborate more on how literature and the arts could play a role in kind of romanticizing history, but also how we might use it to counter that tendency. So I guess the question of aesthetics or political aesthetics in some sense, if either of you wanted to speak to that. And then the final one, and maybe it links up somewhat with Suraj's question, is by Tiffany, who asks, in what historical way and current reality does the predominant religion of Christianity track with colored cosmopolitanism, imperialism, the new Jim Crow, or does it in fact track? What impact, I think they mean to ask, does this have, or do you imagine religion, churches, Christianity playing in equality and equitable outcomes? Or perhaps if not. And I think this is very interesting given that there's a long kind of missionary history, if you will, that is actually, it seems to me, one of the first modern moments where race and caste are analogized, if I'm not wrong. And then we can think about even, people writing about caste in the church in the United States and so on and so forth. So religion, maybe allyship, but also who speaks for whom and what's the project now, the current intellectual project. And then this interesting question about political aesthetics, new imaginaries that can challenge existing paradigms. And feel free, Sonali, and just, whatever you wanted to respond to, and then we could move to Nico if you wanted to, but just, throwing it open to both of you.
I was hoping that we could go to Nico first, but let me, I really am gathering my thoughts, at least about this question. I think very question close to my heart about how we engage with the political imagination that is given to us through literature or aesthetics, in terms of engaging with sort of the ethical dilemmas in history, and how we think about these things. I mean, some of the writers that I engage with in my own work actually are not really romanticized.
No.
Sort of historical predicaments, but I mean, people like Mukraj Anand and Maswita Devi, who I read in translation, are thinking about sort of, again, intersectional, to sort of anachronistically use that term, sort of overlaid questions of class and caste oppression and labor and forms of slavery that are sort of ongoing and present in our lives, right? In our moment. But also I've been thinking about, and this is kind of not properly formulated, but in terms of thinking about also how Du Bois also, of course, wrote novels and wrote, but many would tend to sort of engage with certain of, maybe there would be like very specific novels of Du Bois that we could come to bring to bear on these particular questions. But I recently read and have been thinking with Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives and Beautiful, I'm maligning the title, even though I taught it very recently. And I'm thinking about the kind of project that, the kind of work that sort of engages with literature and the aesthetic imagination, if you will, with beauty, in these terms of sort of searching after a form. And I think that there's really great potential for thinking kind of improvised genres that could supplement the work that needs to be done, could supplement the historical imagination in writers of political fiction in this way. So that's what I'll say. It's a little bit scattered. I'm not always good with thinking on my feet.
Thank you. This is great. Nico, did you want to take up any of these questions? And we can, kind of do a round robin. We could come back again. I actually have a question about, I think, class and labor. So whenever we get a chance. Nico, yeah, please.
Absolutely. Thank you. Wow, what a rich series of questions. First, if I can, Suraj, I don't know if you're still able to hear, but I would just say that your work has been very powerfully shaping of my own views. And so I'm honored to receive a question from you in this context. And the question that you raised regarding positionality is one that I've thought about for a very long time on a personal level, as well as an intellectual level. As a white American who studies African American and South Asian history, I'm constantly thinking to myself and talking with my peers and my students about what it means to be an ally and what the limits are of that kind of solidarity. And I try to learn from the past, from those that I study. So let me try actually to answer that question, or at least part of that question. It's a really rich and important one, and link it to the other. So this is a little bold, friends. Hopefully it'll work. But through the lens of Du Bois's Dark Princess. So, I expect this is a text many of you are familiar with. If you're not, I encourage you to read it. It's a remarkably rich and interesting book. Du Bois at one point calls it his favorite of his books. It's a novel about an Indian princess who rises to become the leader of the colored world in resistance, and ends up partnering up with an African-American man to sort of forge the solidarity of resistance. It's a wonderful example of how literature can simultaneously advance particular solidarities, while I think allowing fertile ground for others to reimagine what those solidarities might mean. Dark Princess has its failings, as I view it. I think it has its limitations, it has its problems. But what it does is what I think all great literature does, which is that it challenges us in a way that allows us to then create our own, to use Robin Kelly's old phrase, freedom dreams, right? There's an imaginative, creative project here that I think Dark Princess really embodies. And I think that's what literature and the arts can do. I had the pleasure of working with a dancer and choreographer named Anjal Chande to create a work that's it's sort of a blend of classical Indian dance and more modern dance that is reinterpreting Kamaladevi Chattopadhyaya's story. We did that for a Smithsonian exhibition on solidarities of color. And it was one of my favorite things I've ever been able to do as a historian is to work with an artist to try to imagine how to bring this history into a very different lens or frame. And one of the things that struck me right away, just sort of mirroring
we lost the last bit of that last sentence, Nico.
Okay. Oh, sorry.
Up for a moment. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Sorry. No, thank you for telling me. Okay. So did you hear me talk about Anjal and Anais? We did this collaboration. The key thing I took from that collaboration is that that art and literature are not mirrors that reproduce politics or social solidarities, right? They're not just telling the story. They're reimagining it. They're creating it anew and afresh. And I think Du Bois's Dark Princess is an example of that. It is, to bring it back to Suraj's question, it's also an example of the problem of people trying to create solidarities for those who are of other identities. In this case, Du Bois is a Black man, but much of that book is about gender. And some of the more problematic facets of that book, I think, come from the fact that it's a man writing about a woman. So there's always a challenge there, trying to narrate or imagine the solidarities of others, and it's one I struggle with very directly. Last, in terms of religion, there's a lot of religion in my first book, and that surprised me. I didn't plan it that way, but the story of Christianity is absolutely central in very complicated ways to the transmission of Gandhian nonviolence. Right? It's not a surprise that many of the African American figures who draw on nonviolence most directly and engage it most directly are Christian theologians, right? Black Christian theologians. But there are also other very rich religious ties. So, Sonali, you mentioned Swami Vivekananda earlier, right? There are a variety of Hindu swamis and other religious figures who come to the U.S. and forge connections. Islam plays a very important and interesting role, going back to the Ahmadi movement that has very strong roots in the Black community and helps sort of lay the foundation for the Nation of Islam. And the Nation of Islam draws very heavily on South Asian Muslim thinkers in a variety of different ways and contexts. There are Buddhist links and neo-Buddhist links when you think about Ambedkar. So anyway, the religious ties are rich and incredibly complicated and interesting, and often do create solidarities, but also bring problems with them. Again, Christian missionaries are a great example of a group that are often trying to attack one kind of hierarchy while building all sorts of other hierarchies. So that was my best effort responding to three very rich questions, and thank you all very much for asking them.
Thank you. We've got a couple more, and I'm going to take those on. Again, there's one from Rohini Shukla who asks about work. How is religion a framework, or how it could be used to situate caste race analogies in early modern times? She's looking at the 16th to the 18th centuries, and whether it's kind of the Portuguese and then those broader other worlds of Indian Ocean connectivity, or how you might think about this. I guess I'm just throwing this question out. And then there's a question from Manuela Chiotti, which I think is asking, it's a question about method, I think, and it says, I have a question regarding the recursiveness of the caste and race problematic in the US analogy, versus the disappearance of comparison between African Americans and Dalits. And I'd like to hear Nico and Sonali's thoughts on this. And I guess this is a kind of methodological question, sort of extraordinary. And I wonder if I could also sort of add on to that, because I had been thinking about, Nico, this broader question of sort of method and the ways in which you use the term analogy. What is historical comparison for? And so what does the project of kind of historical comparison actually allow us to do? And clearly there's always the question of kind of scale and appropriateness and so on. But it seems to me that there's a broader question too about sort of method. You began by talking about how you're interested in thinking sort of through people. But I wonder then what happens to kind of conceptual worlds, or what we may think of as questions that intellectual historians may pose around the very ways in which, for instance, caste itself is transforming as a conceptual category at this time, or race itself, or in this particular moment of sort of the interwar into the World War II period that both of you were speaking about, Nico and Sonali. Du Bois, the big move for Du Bois, especially with Black Reconstruction, is the shift into labor and communism. And that actually becomes the universalizing move in some sense for Du Bois, right? So if you think about Black Reconstruction, the argument there about the way that race is both dematerialized and rematerialized in the context of the shift from slavery into wage labor, let's say, and so on. But that question of the kind of internationalism that I think Sonali brought up, and the significance of sort of labor, perhaps as a kind of mediating term between race and caste, I think I also wanted to ask you about. This is a little bit different. I'll let that sit. But you also have Manuela's question, and I think about important one about African American versus Dalit, and then race and caste.
Mm-hmm. Oh God. Mm.
I just have to thank you, Anu, for making Sonali always go first here. That's like a real gift.
Terrible.
This time.
Look at that. Well, before I forget, this is sort of tacked onto the response to the last question in terms of scholarship on religion and caste. I just also wanted to bring forward Gauri Vishwanathan's work on conversion and thinking about, that's also a book on comparison in a different register, and brings up method in very important, interesting ways. That period that the questioner asked about, that is at the limits. I cannot take that on. But the question of method and the question, Anu, I mean, you're folding in of this sort of really important shift of thinking, really where languages of caste, how they operate, whether as sort of concept metaphor for systemic racism, or where labor might function as a kind of mediating term, especially in that historicized context that you bring forward of thinking about, Black Reconstruction and this mode. I think that is so crucial. In my discipline, I mean, I really don't have, this is the question, and I'm excited to be thinking about it, but I feel like I'm just thinking aloud. In my discipline, there's this interesting kind of moment where some scholars put forward this idea of comparative racialization that was really taking the measure after a certain moment in US literary and cultural studies, which took its bearing from race, writing, and difference, to thinking about other ways of engaging sort of the discursivity of these ideas. But I think it's crucial. I think there's something really important to be looking at without sort of shying away from the kind of rift that's glossed over in cosmopolitanism and internationalism, where it's mediated by labor, internationalism, even in a wish fulfillment kind of way. And I think Du Bois's, Du Bois is so crucial to thinking that through the work on Black Reconstruction. That's what I'll offer up. Yeah.
I can build right off that. Actually, I just want to echo, Sonali, what you said about paying attention to that rift and not reglossing it. I think that I know your question about historical comparison, what it's for. It's a really important one, and I think it reminds us that there's a big difference between what we as scholars find in comparison and also in studying connection, and what it means to look at how those, for me as a historian, to look at how those in the past, or for a scholar to look at how contemporary activists or others are using these forms of comparison or connection to directly engage and try to change social and political structures. So, you're absolutely right. And I tried to call out my own tendency towards the biographical. I often think that way. I often teach that way. I think for a variety of reasons, but one is that I find so many of these figures so compelling. I like to learn from them and think with them. But you're absolutely right that in many cases, it's equally important, if not more important, to think about how the key terms here, the key concepts, are debated and transfigured. And in the Lord Cornwallis book, I chose to sort of structure that book through three key terms. So I have these three keyword chapters, one on the word Indian, which of course has a long, rich history of linkage between the US and India, those that are sometimes referred to as Native Americans, but often, are Indian Americans, or referred to by specific tribal names, get lumped together through that key term. Then there's a chapter on caste, and the last one I chose to do is the word thug. This can get us a little bit, I think, into issues of class and the new Jim Crow was referenced earlier. That word thug of Indian origin gets brought into the American context and racialized over time in a way that speaks to the intersection of racial and class hierarchies, particularly to the role of the criminal justice system or criminal injustice system in perpetuating these racial inequalities, and the caste dimensions of that term are almost basically entirely lost. The Indian origins of it are actually largely lost. Most Americans, right, who use the word thug have no idea or no conception that it's coming from an Indian origin, and there's any kind of transnational linkage. And this gets us a little bit at Manuela's question, which I find quite rich and provocative. It's a strange and peculiar moment to be thinking about these sorts of linkages, in part because so many people in the United States are grappling with issues of race and racism in new and compelling ways. In part because the Wilkerson book, and I'm looking forward to attending that event. By the way, I'm very excited about it. Is such a compelling and sort of earth-shaking effort at engaging the issue of caste in ways that raises all sorts of questions for us to engage upon. And if you look at the Wilkerson's book, one of the things that struck me about it right away is that although there's a lot in that book about the history of connection, of linkages, particularly between Dalits and African Americans, it's primarily a book of comparative history, right, in which the idea of caste is being deployed as an analytical frame for understanding race in the United States and understanding oppression more generally in the global term. And that's, we have a very small time. I don't want to say that's good or bad or one thing or another. I'm not trying to pass judgment on it. I just found it interesting that that's the lens that the book takes. And I think that there are both advantages and disadvantages to approaching history that way, and also to approaching our contemporary struggles in that way. Mm-hmm. Oh, just one last very brief thing. I just wanted to say that Rohini Shukla's question about early modern times and Malik Ambar, I addressed Malik Ambar a little bit in my first work called Cosmopolitanism. I find that history incredibly rich and engaging. It's not one that I know well, and I'm very aware as a historian, I'm pretty much a 20th century historian, a little bit going to the 19th century. So you get back to those days and I'm drawing almost entirely on the work of others to base my knowledge. But I will say that I think there's an incredibly rich and compelling work to be done still in that historical ambit, and that many of the people I studied are looking back to those times, are interested in them.
Yeah. No, and I think, I just want to kind of go back to this last question about race, caste, and African Americans and Dalits, and I think it kind of brings us back, perhaps also to Suraj's opening question, right? Because it does actually kind of configure or constellate around that. And what I heard both of you saying is that there's sort of the word, and there's a kind of nominalism and a nominalization that happens with race and caste, right? As part of the move, as questions of transnational solidarity come up, but then we're also thinking systemically or systematically, but also thinking in terms of social relationality, right? That these are terms that configure various forms of inequality and difference. And so if one begins to think systemically or systematically, then race and caste can't do the work, or cannot, it's not sufficient to think about African Americans and Dalits in a sense for thinking about race and caste as broader orders, in a sense, world making and also word making, right? Logics that are set in play, which are actually about a very complex set of social encounters and social relationalities. And so, it seems that, we're always kind of toggling between, in some sense, the name and what it more broadly is supposed to index. And then maybe also the kind of insufficiency of those imagined utopias and connections, that earlier question about sort of political aesthetics and what does it take to make something whole, because, the historical fragment in some sense produces certain kinds of suggestions, but it also produces very deep kinds of foreclosures. And a lot of those have to do with foreclosures around time and period, right? Historicism, if we think of it in those terms, because there are certain things that history makes possible and other things that actually did foreclose. So Nico's very lovely point that, what happens with the UN moment and Indians actually suddenly becoming diplomats, and in that sort of UN post-Bandung moment, actually laying claim to a certain kind of elite vision, right, of third worldism, rather than the forms of caste, class, race solidarity that, someone like Du Bois is calling out, and certainly someone like Ambedkar is deeply invested in. So it seems very interesting, but I guess it also does bring us back in a very interesting way. Just thinking of rounding out our conversation, it really does bring us back to the question that I think Suraj posed. Can we have a kind of unmediated relationship between African Americans and Dalits, and ways to rethink that connection in terms of both an intellectual, but also, I hear him saying, a kind of political project, right? That doesn't require maybe some of the mediations that we've been speaking about. If either of you wanted to speak to that or just have a last word, I'd like to leave both of you with your final words, and then we'll cut out after that. In a minute or less. Sorry.
I can go first this time, Sonali, just to be kind. You've been so kind to me. Well, honestly, the key thing I just want to say, Anu, is yes and thank you. Yes, I found your last comments did a marvelous job of pulling up so many of these strands together. And I thank you for those comments. I thank you for this invitation. I'd also like to thank Sonali again, and thank all of you for the opportunity to speak with you, and for the comments and questions that you all posed. As I said at the outset, I wish I could see you all and we all be in the same room, but if we were in one room, it's unlikely that so many of us would be able to join. So I see some upsides to this, and I'm very grateful for having been able to participate in this way. Thank you.
I will echo my thanks, and thanks to you, Nico. Thanks to you, Anu, for sort of bringing together all these questions, and for everyone who was able to join us. I think I want to keep the question of allyship really open, in terms of really struggling to think with it. A wonderful colleague ended one of her talks by speaking of a Black American feminist, ended a talk by speaking of we need to think allyship as kinship. And I felt very comforted by that. But I just, again, in terms of thinking about the sort of interactional history and thinking about who says, who extends the invitation and who sort of feels recognized through assimilation. I want to really put pressure and think about those things. And I think this is a very important question for all of us to keep alive, to think with, actively, to push our ethics and our politics to really responsibly engage with. I'm going to leave it open. Thank you.
Thank you both very, very much. And I want to thank everybody who stayed with us. And I think we have many people also on YouTube live streams. So thank you wherever all of you are for joining us and for continuing to engage and interact with us. Please be well. And in solidarity, Jai Bhim, actually.